Hey, good morning. I'm here with Sue Bowness, who is the founder of Code Word Communications. Sue is like insanely cool. She's a professor. She is an awesome writer, and we're going to talk about all kinds of things like words today. All kinds of things, words. I have no words as per normal when I'm speaking out loud. But yeah, so we want to talk about like all the things that have kind of brought you to this point. But I know you've got some other things you want to make sure we cover too. And you just got approved by the Canadian Tourism Association as one of the journalists, which is so cool. So I want to know more about that. And before, there's so many things that I could introduce you as, but can we start there?
Sure. Thanks for having me on, Erin. I have a few clients that are, a couple that are standing offers through the Canadian government. And so, I've been working for a couple of those clients. And it's a standing offer is when you are on call and approved as a writer and editor. And so I'm available for all the kinds of writing that organizations need. I have written news releases and articles, that kind of thing, on sort of as requested by those kinds of organizations. And the interest in travel writing came up. I've always been an avid traveler, and I have a blog called Weeks in the World, and that is where I make the most of my vacation travel by blogging about it. So I have vacation travel blogs from when I went to the UK, going to Spain, going to Ireland, or a few of the recent trips. And I love doing travel writing. It's kind of a challenging market these days because everybody loves to do travel writing. And so you're competing with that. The publications are sort of paying less for travel writing because there's so much competition these days. So it's hard to find those markets. So when it's hard to find a market, you create your own market. And so I started writing the blog a few years ago and just capturing those trips. Actually, it's a really good memory boost for me because, you don't remember all the fantastic details of everywhere you went. But now I do because I have this place where I put them all together. So it's a value for me. And then I'm always looking for travel clients. It's not my major focus as a business, but it is something that I love to do and would love to have more clients in. So it's definitely a passion of mine to travel, and why not write about it?
I love that. And it's like, when I think we were talking just before we went live about living in Costa Rica, and it was kind of before blogs were a thing. But I'd send emails home that my mom saved. It's like, I'd love to figure out if I can find those still, if she still got them. Because it's like, what would have happened if I'd gone down that path like 20 years ago, which is crazy to say. But yeah, like what would have happened? But it's interesting you say that that's how you started your travel blog. That is how I started a food blog in 2009 or 10. It was like, I want to keep track of these recipes I'm finding. And it's so cool, like what you can do with them. And that's really how I trace back my start to the online business world and becoming a copywriter. But I actually did it for longer. But anyway, that we're not here to talk about me. We're here to talk about like all the things marketing and messaging and content writing. And you are also a professor and a PhD, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how did you get into that path? Like what brought you to this point? I'm super curious.
Yeah, so I started out, I've been working on I started my writing business 20 years ago, Code Word Communications. And I started it at a point of sadness and anger as I got laid off from the magazine where I was working, my favorite magazine at the time. But I had admired the career path of these freelancers who seemed to come into the office and meet with editors and then go on their way and produce fantastic stories. So I thought, well, this is earlier than I had planned, but maybe it's for me. And I just discovered this way of working really worked for me. So I started my own business, and I have done a mix of journalism and content writing for corporate clients. And along the way, I had also, at the time when I was working at the magazine, I had started my master's degree and actually was writing my thesis about the magazine's history. It was called Saturday Night. And so I wrote that as a master's thesis. And then at the same time, I discovered there's lots of other Canadian magazines of the 19th century that have not been studied very well. And so I thought that was a great PhD project. At the same time, I'd also started teaching at a local college in Toronto, and thought maybe this is my pathway, and at least it's a nice balance, both in terms of social exposure for getting out of my home office to meet new students, and also maybe a good balance. So I went to the teaching path via the PhD. I got a lot of opportunity to teach at my university when I did the PhD in English at the University of Ottawa. And so that was great experience and was a good balance for my business. I did end up moving back to Toronto and started teaching at Humber College, and was invited to help to develop a writing program, which we launched in 2015. And I'm happy to say is doing well. And I've met lots of great students from there, so now I have this great connection network of younger, smart writers that I can call on if I ever need them. And then it's great to just see how their careers are going. And teaching your skill is a new way of thinking about your skills. So, it really balances nicely with my writing life to be able to think about how to teach something. And so, I've enjoyed teaching part-time as I continue my writing business full-time.
Awesome. And so what is your favorite thing to teach about? What do you do the most teaching on?
Yeah, so I like to teach about the kind of writing that I do, which is a lot of content narrative writing, specifically constructing articles. I also like to teach about freelancing because it's something I'm so familiar with that I have this natural years of experience doing it. And it's something that students have a lot of questions about, because there's, I think, a lot of myths to freelancing that people don't understand, both how challenging it can be and how rewarding it can be. And so that's fun to be able to pass that knowledge along. And then in terms of as a writer, I just like to pass along even how to read a magazine the way that a writer would read a magazine, right? Like looking for the kinds of stories that it contains, looking, even at individual story. Hey, I really like this story. Why do I like it, right? And is it because it has a really compelling opening? Is it because it's well structured? Is it because it does something different with the way that the reader approaches it, or its interaction with the reader? So I like being able to share stories and magazines and see why they work, and then inspire students to buy their own thing, right? To learn, just like you do in painting, you learn how to do the classic stuff, and then you branch out on your own, right? So I feel like it's really important to get a good grounding in like how to write an article properly, and then to practice, and then to experiment.
Well, I think that's super interesting, and it goes back to like some of the magazines that you've studied too, and like how you've seen it change over the course of centuries, literally, because like I'm sure the best practices, well, of course the best practices have changed, but I'm sure the story structure has not changed a whole lot. Like the things that make something interesting, or has it changed? I don't know.
That's an interesting question, because it actually has changed in some ways. I guess what hasn't changed is like editors thinking about their audiences and what would appeal to them. So back in the 19th century, you had a lot more fiction, for example. You had a lot more gossip columns, so where people would say, oh, Ms. Smith went to X and Y party in the city of Toronto, and she met up with Ms. Brown and Ms. Green, kind of thing. And so there had a lot more society columns. You had a lot more fiction. You still had news of the day, but newspapers covered that. So magazines were a little bit freer to publish short stories and publish all sorts of different kinds of articles. So those are the things that were a little bit different. We don't have as much fiction being published in magazines today. And of course, the length has changed in terms of there used to be like pages and pages of stories in magazines back then. And now, magazines have obviously gone a lot shorter and also gone online and that kind of thing. So it's interesting to see like over the years, the changes and different things. But I would have to say one of the things that I studied in my thesis that was really interesting was that in some of the early magazines, they used to publish advice to the writers about how they're writing right in the magazine, I guess, because they didn't have direct contact, or they were wanting, I speculate that they were wanting to have their readers or their potential writers learn from it as well. So they would say something like, Ms. Brown's story is far too flowery and needs to be trimmed back. Or they would say, so they would put like all this advice. So I looked at that advice and extrapolated about like what kinds of things were the editors looking for in their magazine? How are they guiding, like right in the front page where you could see it as a writer, how embarrassing, that the points for improvement.
It's interesting. It's almost like a review without any advance notice.
That's right. Yeah. So, I mean, it's the one thing because there's not really any archives of the editorial process from back then. We have to try to find what we can in terms of like trying to figure out what were the editors thinking. And so, looking at those pieces of advice in the few magazines where they existed, looking at, I looked at a lot of like editorial prefaces, which means like at the beginning when somebody launched a magazine, they would write their manifesto of what they wanted to do with the magazine. And from that, we saw a lot of like, what do they want to accomplish in Canadian literature, which I think is really interesting for our beginning.
That's super cool. And I think, like I jotted down notes over here, like how to read a magazine the right way a writer would, but also like what today's writers can learn from magazines from the 1800s. I think that's so cool. Like we could dig into that for like, I don't know, an entire half an hour easily.
Yeah.
But what I had like all these other questions I was going to ask, and then that like struck me as something really interesting. But maybe we can also like kind of use that as a segue into, their topics were so different from the topics today. But how do you come up with story ideas? Because that's something else that you teach, right? Like story ideation.
That's right. Yeah. So that's one of the things that is such a big question. And especially, I have to say, it's still challenging 20 years in to figure out, like, what is the idea before it comes into the news, right? Because by the time that you see it on the news, it's already been published. It's already known kind of thing, right? So trying to find, like, those hidden ideas, I think, is a big challenge, especially if you're pitching journalism. And a few of my tactics are to like read a lot. So read a lot, become really familiar with what is old and new in your niche, and then just keeping an eye out, like an idea file is what I keep for ideas within my niche, and things that maybe you'll read a tiny little excerpt in or a tiny little story in, say, the Commuter magazine, and that could be developed into a bigger story. Sometimes you'll read a story that's published in a trade magazine or a specialty industry magazine, and you think, wow, that deserves more coverage and attention from people in the general public. And so then you could pitch that story to a bigger magazine or newspaper, that kind of thing. So just like keeping an eye out and then telling everybody that that you're looking for stories, right? And then people start to mention, you become like good at parties in terms of people are always like pitching you a story and say, oh, have you heard about this? And you're always asking like, oh, anything new to tell me about in your industry, or that kind of thing, to try to find the new story, right? Because it's so challenging to know about the news before it's news.
Yeah, well, and especially with the 24/7 news cycle now, when things that may not have been newsworthy even 10 years ago, people are clamoring for, because it's something to like pull an interesting angle off of, whether or not, depending on the publication, whether or not that angle is, whatever that is. But so what is your niche? You have a heavy focus on journalism, but what else are you doing?
So I have written journalism in the past in my
Okay.
business. So I write under my byline, obviously. As a journalist, I've focused on. I started out writing about technology, and then I moved into writing about business. I've written about careers in HR a lot over the years, which I find like the fact that we all work 8 hours a day and there's not a whole lot of magazines or writing about it is really curious to me. So I've always kind of pursued that. And then in the last few years, I've also become interested in education. And so writing about trends in education as a journalist. And then in terms of a client base, I work in education. Mostly because I love writing articles, and that provides a great market for writing articles and blog posts and that kind of thing. Just basically telling the stories. Both I like writing about research, which is like another area I find is not that well covered or publicized. I think it's improving, but there's so much amazing research going on in all departments at universities that I think the public could stand to know more about all the crazy things that are being explored. So that is an area. And then also I like writing about people. So I love doing profiles. I like writing about the success stories, and a lot of those are found at success in research, success by students doing cool things and that kind of thing. So that is partly what attracts me to that market, because there's lots of opportunities for telling those stories. So I do that as providing journalistic style writing to clients in that area and other areas.
Got it. So there's two sides to your business then, if I'm recapping. There's the journalism side, and then there's also the education side.
Yeah, well, I should reframe to say I have written journalism. That is actually a challenging market as a freelancer,
Right.
in the sense of
Yeah.
there's fewer magazines these days. They're unfortunately paying less. And so, like most freelance journalists, I've had to seek out writing in the content space, where I can find the writing that's quite similar, telling stories in the corporate world, then I go in that direction, right? So in terms of, finding a niche, I define my niche partly in education because I have worked in that space, but more so in journalistic style writing and content writing, right? So I will write blogs for money because they tell stories, and you can do profiles and you can do all sorts of interesting things with long form. So I really define myself these days as a long form content writer.
Well, I think blog writing has changed quite a bit over the last 10 years. I mean, food blogs used to be about the story, and now they're all about SEO, as we all know, like the doom scroll to get down to the actual recipe, which is, again, where I started. But they used to be almost like journal entries for a very long time. I feel like they were very like a public diary almost. And I'm trying to put my finger on when that changed. I think it was probably about 2012. When I probably when the iPhone got more and more widespread and people were able to do more on their phones. And I don't know, there's probably some interesting studies that we could do to correlate that information. But I would say 2011, 2012, from my perspective, is when more news started to be online. More news was, people were getting more of their content from their phones, and they could take it anywhere. So, I mean, I don't know. What do you think about that? When did it change from your perspective?
It's been really interesting. So that's what I think longevity brings you, is that like over 20 years, you can talk about how the blog has changed. And I think that's such a good example of a form that really has changed. So I feel like totally agree that it used to be this kind of diary format, and then organizations picked up on it to be, here's a way we can tell our stories, that kind of thing. So, it went a bit more formalized. I think about maybe, I would say probably around 2012, it got really short. Like nobody wanted a blog that was a post that was over 400 words, right? For a few years. And then it got really long recently, right? So that, even a couple of years ago, it was starting to people were wanting blog posts that were like 1,200 words, right? And now, it's sort of settled somewhere in the middle, I think, in terms of like you can write a blog post that's anywhere from 600 words to 1,500 words, right? And so I think the word count has really changed. And I think you're right, the instinct that that's partly SEO. And certainly you can't write a blog without thinking about keywords these days, right? But I'm hoping that it moves in a direction that is like, or stays in a direction where there's a human involved in creating it and finding the story in it, because I feel like that's what gets blogs to be a bit of a drag, is when they go overly SEO and, they're not really thinking about the reader as much. They're thinking about like, how do we get this out there? And, their keyword stuffing used to be a thing. Now, finally, people are realizing that that doesn't work. Nobody wants to read like a keyword heavy, ugly blog, right? So I think moving back towards the narrative style is helpful. And that's certainly the kind of blog that I want to write, while acknowledging that keywords have their place.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting. Like, I never saw the push towards much shorter blogs. I was working at an organization in 2012, and the only thing that I could get them to use their blog for was press releases, which, guess who also got to write those? But it was really interesting. And finally, after I left, is when they decided, oh, there's opportunity here to tell stories. And it was like, yes, there is. There's lots of opportunity to tell stories, which is what I'd been pushing for quite a while. But it was really an interesting thing. And we were not into SEO at all at that point. It was like literally about telling the story and showing the possibilities and showing, what people could experience. So I think that's a really interesting correlation. And I'm with you on that. I think that, the future is a combination of posts that are obviously just optimized for keywords, still super good content, right? Like still super valuable. But the flip side of that is the thought leadership piece. And how else are you going to put your opinions out there, establish yourself as thought leader in this space? Like, how else can you do that? I think that's interesting. And I mean, I don't know, we could probably make some predictions. Like, I think that's valid. We could co-author a piece on the predictions for blogs in 2025 and beyond. But hey, let's make note of that as an article idea as we're talking about story ideation. But I think that's really interesting. And I think you're spot on. People are talking about AI a lot. And I think it's good for idea generation. And I think it's good, but I don't know. I don't think writers are ever going to go away. Because who else is going to mine that story? Who else is going to mine the thought leadership besides the person who's actually writing it, whether they're a writer by trade or a business leader who is like, no, this is how it should be.
I hope not. And I've been reading and sharing a lot of articles, not a lot, but maybe like 2 or 3 recently, about AI and the takeover and stuff like that, right? I mean, I think I remain optimistic that it's going to still require a writer in there somewhere. And, I do look for the places maybe you will help me as a writer to get some ideas, as you say, and keywords and stuff like that to help my process. But I don't think the robots are taking over quite yet, but I'm keeping an eye on you, robots.
Robots, listen up.
The robots, yeah. So.
Oh, that's funny. Well, we've covered so many different things here. What would you say is one of the biggest misconceptions that you see or that you feel like you have to overcome?
You mean as a writer or like in this industry?
Yes, both, whatever.
Yeah. I think like a misconception for writing and freelancing is that there's in terms of there's a lot of opportunity and there's no opportunity, right? So I think you do need to find the opportunities and look for places that are requiring writing. I think there's been an explosion of text in the last few years, right? As people don't want to speak to each other on the phone, although, text and articles and that kind of thing, I think that's not going away, right? I think, though, that we need to make sure that people like writers are properly compensated, that they can be connected with the opportunities and that kind of thing. So I think, just having organizations realize the potential of writing and storytelling, I think that's still an ongoing project. And it's a misconception that we're totally moving away, but then it's exciting to see things like video, right? Where we weren't doing as much like 5 years ago. And now that has expanded as a storytelling form, right? The expansion of visual platforms has been interesting, but I think there's always going to be a place for words. And so, whenever anybody predicts the demise of the blogging or the demise of, newsletters or that kind of thing, look at how newsletters have grown in the past few years, right? So I think there's always potential for people starting new ideas.
Well, and I think you're spot on there. I think there's always a place for words. I think that's a really powerful quote, by the way. But there is, because no matter, I was talking to Dana Malstaff a couple of years ago, and she's like, there's 3 ways to generate content. There's audio, video, and writing. And those are the three options, and they are not mutually exclusive, for the sole reason that there's different people who consume content differently. I either do really well with video, or I do really well with writing, or some combination thereof. Listening to just audio, I don't do as well with. So if I'm listening to audio calls, and there is no video, I transcribe it so I can read it along while I'm listening, because it's like the dual impact. So I think you're right. There will always be a spot for the written word, particularly in content form, because of that, because there are people who maybe they're really fast readers and they can consume this piece of content in 2 minutes versus 10 with someone reading. And wouldn't that be a better use of your time, depending on what it is, depending on how your brain works? I think it's super interesting. It goes back to, how do you learn? Do you learn by hearing, by doing, or by seeing?
Yeah,
okay,
and the third one. All these formats lately, right? What you said just reminded me of podcasting, right? Like being a show note writer 5 years ago was not a thing, and now it's a thing, right? And even like the rise of so many podcasts, and yes, it's an oral form, but it's also like a written form, in the sense that people are thinking, structuring, composing their podcasts, that kind of thing. And so it's another area where writing, in the guise of audio, has exploded, which is fun to see.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. I feel like we need to continue this conversation again soon. But with that said, we are just about at the 30-minute mark. So where can people find you to learn more about you?
Yeah, thanks. So my website is Codeword Communication. It's at codeword.ca, codeword.ca. I'm in Canada.
It is in the destination, or the words that go. There's always a place for words. It is in the description.
Yeah, that's right. So that's where you can find me online. I'm also on Twitter at Suzanne Bowness, and same thing on LinkedIn. So find me and say hello.
Excellent. And you have a newsletter as well. Where can people sign up to gain your insights?
That's right. Yeah. So it's at codeword.ca. So just go there and sign up. Okay. I write a monthly newsletter to keep everybody updated on my projects. And then I also include links about interesting things going on in communications, like we've talked about today.
Awesome. Well, and I'm on your newsletter. It's fantastic. I love reading it. So I encourage everyone listening now or later to sign up. But if there's any lasting thoughts, what you wish people knew about either working with you or working with writers on a whole, what would they be?
I just think I'm here to create content. I'm happy to, whenever I'm a big reader of content, so I'm always scanning for new articles, new ideas, new ways of doing things. And that's what I help my clients to do, is write great content, write great stories.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I'm going to go ahead and hit end here. And I look forward to continuing the conversation in the next couple of months.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.